scout vessel Quiet Current dropped out of transit 11 light-years past the edge of charted Thrin space, and the first thing its sensors found was not a star system worth logging. It was silence. A wrong kind of silence, the kind that came from a region of space too clean, too empty of the drifting rock and gas that should have surrounded a dead system this old. Fleet Preceptor Ilan Vosk stood at the command rail of the bridge, four segmented eyes tracking the readouts scrolling across the translucent display in front of her, and she felt the particular unease that came from finding order where chaos should be. "Report," she said, her voice carrying the flat calm that 30 years of deep survey work had trained into her. Her sensor officer, a younger Thrin named Kale Dorn, hesitated before answering, which was itself unusual. Thrin officers did not hesitate. "Preceptor, we have a single contact, approximately 400 meters in diameter, metallic, non-native materials. It is in a stable orbit around a star that should not have anything left orbiting it. This system's primary went nova 900,000 years ago by our stellar models." "An object in orbit around a corpse star," Vosk said. "Debris, then, something that survived the collapse." "Negative, Preceptor. Debris does not maintain orbital stability for 900,000 years. Debris does not still have power." The bridge went quiet. Not the wrong kind of silence this time, but the human kind, though there were no humans aboard the Quiet Current to name it that way. It was simply the silence of an entire crew of veteran explorers realizing, all at once, that they had found something that was not supposed to exist. The Thrin Ascendancy had been a spacefaring civilization for 1.8 million years, a fact they did not state so much as they breathed it, the way older species tend to wear their age like a second skin. They had watched 100 younger civilizations rise from single planets, stumble through their first faltering steps into orbit, and either flourish or extinguish themselves in the same handful of millennia it took a Thrin city to change its architectural fashion. The Ascendancy did not fear younger species. It cataloged them, guided some, ignored most, and never once had it needed to reconsider its own place in the order of things. That was about to change. Vosk ordered a careful approach, weapons at standby but not active, sensors running full spectrum. As the Quiet Current closed the distance, the object resolved from a sensor ghost into something almost mundane in shape. A cylindrical hull, solar collection vanes long since folded and dark, a cluster of dish-shaped antennae, and along one flank, a series of raised markings that no database in the ship's memory could translate. Not because the markings were alien in the sense of unfamiliar. They were alien in the sense of forgotten, old symbols, a dead script, or one so ancient that even its living descendants had changed beyond recognition. "Power signature confirmed," Dorn said, his voice tighter now. "It's minimal, a trickle, but it's real and it's stable and Preceptor. The isotopic decay in the housing shell puts this object's construction date at approximately 2.3 million years before present." Vosk did not respond immediately. She was doing the same arithmetic every officer on the bridge was doing, and none of them liked the answer. 2.3 million years. 500,000 years before the first Thrin had left their homeworld's atmosphere. Older than the oldest ruin the Ascendancy had ever catalogued from any species, anywhere, in any survey. Older, by a significant margin, than the Ascendancy's own recorded memory of itself. "Confirm the material composition," she said quietly. The answer came back a few minutes later, and it was the detail that turned a strange discovery into a crisis. The alloy housing the satellite's internal components was not exotic. It was not some vanished supermaterial lost to time. It was, according to the ship's archive, a near match for a class of alloy currently in wide industrial use by one specific, very young, very recently contacted species roughly 900 light-years coreward. Humans. The satellite bore markings, construction methods, and material signatures consistent with human manufacture. A species the Ascendancy had only formally acknowledged 11 standard years earlier, after a chance encounter at a contested mining claim, escalated into the kind of tense, careful diplomacy that avoided war by the width of a hair. A species with barely 400 years of spaceflight to its name. A species whose written historical record did not go back further than roughly 6,000 years, and whose oldest surviving structures were measured in mere millennia. And yet here, in a dead system at the edge of nowhere, orbiting a star that had died 900,000 years ago, sat a machine bee, built by that same species, built, according to every honest reading of the decay signatures, more than 2 million years before that species should have existed at all. Vosk closed her upper set of eyes, a Thren gesture equivalent to a held breath. "Send a priority transmission to Fleet Command," she said. "Flag it Black Tier, and Dorn, get me everything we have on human deep history. Everything. I do not care how speculative." Preceptor, human deep history barely predates their own agricultural era. "I know," Vosk said. "That's what worries me." 900 light-years away, in the offices of the Terran Compact's Directorate of Exterior Affairs, Commander Alina Cade was 3 cups of recycled coffee into a briefing that was already the strangest of her career, and it had only been running for 11 minutes. She was 41 years old, a former Deep Survey pilot turned intelligence liaison, chosen for this posting specifically because she had a rare gift among Compact officers. She could sit across a table from an alien delegation and not flinch, not posture, not perform confidence she didn't feel. She simply listened, asked precise questions, and told the truth even when the truth was inconvenient. It had made her unpopular with certain political factions back on Earth and indispensable to nearly everyone else. "Say that again," she said to the analyst across the table, a wiry man named Priest who ran the Compact's threat assessment desk. "Say it slowly." "The Thren ascendancy," Priest said, "which is, best estimate, somewhere north of 1.8 million years old as a spacefaring civilization, just found a satellite. Human-built, human alloy, human construction techniques as far as their archives can tell, though obviously their archives on us are 11 years deep and mostly guesswork. The satellite is orbiting a star that died 900,000 years ago. Their isotopic dating puts the build date at 2.3 million years before present." "That's not possible," Cade said, because it was the only sane thing to say. "I agree with you," Priest said. "I've run it 4 times. I don't have an alternate explanation. Neither does the Compact's own Deep Archaeology division, and believe me, I called them at 3 in the morning to ask." Cade set down her coffee and looked at the star chart floating above the table, at the small red marker denoting a system so far from Sol that its light, even now, was still traveling toward Earth from a night sky no living human would ever see change. "Why is this landing on my desk instead of a research division's desk?" "Because the Thren didn't send this to a research division," said Director Amara Osai, who had been quiet at the head of the table until now. She was Cade's superior, a career diplomat with the kind of stillness that made rooms lower their voices without being asked. "They sent it to their military high command flagged Black Tier, which in their classification system means it is being treated as a potential act of interstellar significance. And this morning, Commander, they sent a formal request. They want a joint investigation, Thren and human personnel at the site together. That's unusual for them." "It's unprecedented for them," Osai said. "The Ascendancy does not invite outsiders to investigate anything that touches their own history. They have never once done it in the 11 years we've known them. Something about this discovery frightened them enough to break a habit 1,000,000 years old." She paused, letting that settle. "I want you leading our half of that investigation, Alina, not because you're the most senior deep space officer we have. Because you're the one they trust not to lie to them, and right now, that matters more than rank." "Before you go," Priest said, pulling up one more file on the table's display, "there's something else worth knowing, even if it's speculative. We ran a deep comparison against every anomaly report the Compact's Exploration Corps has ever filed and quietly shelved as unexplained. There are 11 of them, going back almost 200 years, all from wildly different regions of explored space, all involving structures or signals that didn't match any known civilization and got written off as sensor error or natural phenomena because nobody had a better explanation, and nobody wanted to be the officer who suggested something impossible. I pulled the raw data on 4 of them this morning. 2 are inconclusive. 2 look a lot like smaller cousins of what the Thren just found. Cade felt something cold settle in her stomach. You're telling me this isn't the first one. It's just the first one anybody took seriously. I'm telling you, Priest said, that if the Thren's dating is even close to accurate, whoever built that satellite didn't leave one marker behind. They left a network, and we've apparently been flying past pieces of it for 2 centuries without recognizing what we were looking at. Osai's expression didn't change, but her voice, when she spoke, carried a weight it hadn't a moment before. Add that to the briefing packet, Priest, flagged for the commander's eyes only until we understand more. Elena, I want you thinking about that on the way out there. If this is a network, then whatever we find at these coordinates may only be the beginning of what we're about to learn about ourselves. Cade looked at the star marker again. Somewhere out there, in the dark between a dead sun and a dying orbit, something with her species' fingerprints on it had been waiting for 2 million years to be found. She felt the particular vertigo of a person whose entire understanding of their own history had just developed a crack. When do we leave? She said. The joint transit took 6 days aboard a Thren diplomatic-grade vessel, the Continuance, which was, in its own understated way, more impressive than anything Cade had ever set foot on. It did not look like a warship. It looked like a monastery built by engineers who had never once needed to hide their strength. The corridors were wide, quiet, lit by soft indirect panels, and everywhere she went she felt the presence of a species that had stopped needing to prove itself sometime around the fall of the last ice age on Earth. Preceptor Ilan Vosk met her personally at the docking bay, 4 eyes taking in the small human delegation, with an expression Cade couldn't yet read. Commander Cade, Vosk said, in the careful, measured Thren dialect of compact standard that their linguistic core had built over the past decade. I confess, I did not expect my career to include a day when I invited humans to help me understand my own species' history. I didn't expect a day when I'd need to, Cade said. For what it's worth, Preceptor, we're as unsettled by this as you are. Something in Vosk's posture eased fractionally. That is the correct answer, she said. Come, I will show you what we found, and then I will show you the part of the transmission we have not yet told your government about. On the 3rd day of transit, unable to sleep through the low hum of a jump drive she didn't fully understand, Cade found herself in the Continuance's small observation gallery, watching the compressed starlight of transit space slide past the viewport in long silver threads. She had not expected company. Preceptor Vosk found her there anyway, standing a respectful distance away for several minutes before speaking. You are troubled, Vosk said. It was not a question. I keep doing the math, Cade admitted. 2 million years. I try to picture it and I can't. Our entire written history doesn't even round up to 0.5% of that number. Every king, every war, every book we've ever written happened in the width of a single afterthought compared to what we're talking about. She shook her head. I grew up believing humanity was the newest thing in this part of the galaxy, the eager young species everyone was patiently tolerating. I built my whole career around that assumption, learning to listen more than I spoke, because I figured we hadn't earned the right to speak first yet. And now you have learned that assumption may have always been incomplete, Vosk said, settling into the seat beside her, an unusually informal gesture for a Thren officer of her rank. I understand the disorientation better than you might expect, Commander. My own career was built on a similar certainty, only mirrored. I was taught that the Ascendancy's age was not simply a fact about us. It was the foundation of our right to lead. Our elders tell our children that we are patient because we have had 1,000,000 years to learn patience, wise because we have had 1,000,000 years to make our mistakes early. If some other lineage was already old when we were still learning to walk upright, then patience and wisdom were never things we earned. They were simply things we had time for. That is a difficult inheritance to question at my age. For what it's worth, Cade said, I don't think it makes either of us smaller. It just means the story's older and stranger than either of us was told. I'd rather know that than keep telling myself a smaller, tidier lie. Vosk was quiet for a long moment, watching the threaded light beyond the viewport. That, she said finally, is precisely the kind of answer that makes me believe my government was correct to insist you lead this investigation, whatever the political cost of admitting it. She rose to leave, then paused at the gallery door. For whatever it is worth in return, Commander Cade, I do not believe the universe places old things above young things by any law but the ones we invent for our own comfort. I have simply never had cause to test that belief before now. She left Cade alone with the stars after that, and Cade sat a long while longer, turning the thought over like a stone worn smooth by a very long river. That got Cade's full attention, theirs. A transmission. The satellite is not merely old, Vosk said, leading her deeper into the ship. It is active. When our scout vessel approached within a certain range, it woke. It has been sending a signal every 11 hours since. We have not been able to fully decode it, but we have decoded enough to know two things. First, it is speaking a structured language, not noise. Second, embedded in the signal, repeating, is a sequence of symbols that our archives match, imperfectly, but with high confidence, to a mathematical constant your species uses in orbital mechanics calculations. It is, Commander, unmistakably designed to be understood by something like you. Cade felt the floor of her assumptions shift another degree. It's a beacon. It is a message, Vosk corrected gently, aimed at whoever came after. The dead system, when the continuance finally dropped into it 11 days later alongside a full escort of compact and Thren vessels, was one of the loneliest places Cade had ever seen. The primary star was a cooling husk, a stellar remnant, throwing off just enough dim red light to outline the debris field where planets had once orbited before the star's collapse had scoured the inner system clean. Against that backdrop, the ancient satellite sat in its stubborn, impossible orbit, a small dark shape lit by the running lights of the ships now gathering around it like mourners at a grave 2,000,000 years too late. Cade rode out to it in a shuttle with a joint Thren-human survey team, and as the little craft drew close, the satellite's antennae array shifted, a slow mechanical motion that made everyone aboard go silent. It was still tracking. Still, after 2,000,000 years, doing the one job it had been built for. It's reacting to our approach, said Lieutenant Priya Anand, the Compact's lead engineer on the mission, her voice hushed with something between awe and dread. Power draw just spiked. It's preparing to transmit. Let it, Cade said. Record everything. The signal came 11 minutes later, a tight, precise burst of structured data that took the combined analytic power of both fleets almost 4 hours to unpack. When it finally resolved into something readable, it wasn't a message in any language currently spoken by humanity. It was older than that, encoded in a mathematical shorthand designed to survive translation across any amount of linguistic drift, the kind of message meant to still make sense after 10,000 generations. But buried inside that ancient structure was something that hit Cade harder than any alien mystery could have. A set of coordinates, and a phrase, painstakingly reconstructed by the linguists working around the clock, that took the Compact's chief cryptolinguist nearly a full day to certify with confidence. It read, as closely as any translation ever could, "To those who come after us, the vault endures, and Saul still owes a debt to what sleeps beneath it." Cade read that line 4 times before she trusted herself to speak. "Saul," she said, That's not a coincidence, that's our star. Whoever built this new Sol, they were tied to it. 2.3 million years ago, said Annan quietly. There was nothing on Earth but early hominids figuring out how to use fire. There was no civilization capable of building this. According to our current archaeological record, Cade said, which apparently has a very large hole in it. Preceptor Vosk, present for the analysis via a secure link from the continuance, spoke into the silence that followed. Commander Cade, I want to be honest with you because I believe our two species cannot afford anything less right now. This discovery does more than complicate your history. It complicates ours. The ascendancy has always measured its worth in part by our age. We are the elders of this region of the galaxy. We have told that story to ourselves for longer than your species has existed in any form. If there was an interstellar human presence 2 million years before your civilization's own recorded beginning, then we are not the elders here. We are, at best, the second oldest thing anyone has found. There was something almost vulnerable in the admission, coming from a species that Cade had only ever known to project calm certainty. You're worried about what this does to how your people see themselves, she said. I am worried about what it does to how certain factions within my government will choose to respond, Vosk said. There are members of our High Assembly who believe the Ascendancy's authority in this region rests on being first, on being oldest, on having earned the right to guide younger species because we walked the path before them. If that claim is no longer true, if it was never entirely true, some of them will not react with curiosity. They will react with the need to reassert dominance before the story changes beneath them. Cade absorbed that and felt the shape of the coming weeks sharpen into something more angorous than an archaeological mystery. You're telling me this discovery could start a war. I am telling you, Vosk said, that I have already received 3 separate inquiries from military factions asking whether the coordinates in that message should be classified, seized, and explored exclusively by Thren forces before your compact can lay any claim to them. I refused to answer those inquiries until I had spoken to you. That will not hold indefinitely. Before Cade could respond, the mission's communications officer flagged an incoming priority signal, patched through from the flagship of the Joint Fleet. It was Director Osai, transmitting from 900 light-years away with the particular urgency reserved for messages that could not wait for the normal relay schedule. Commander, Osai said without preamble, her image slightly grainy from the distance, we have a complication. The coordinates embedded in that satellite's transmission fall inside a region currently claimed, under contested treaty, by the Korathi Dominion. You'll remember them from the border disputes 8 years ago. They are already moving a task force toward that location, and they are not asking permission. Cade closed her eyes briefly. The Korathi Dominion was not the Thren ascendancy. They did not have 1,000,000 years of restraint built into their political culture. They had a fast-expanding, resource-hungry empire built on conquest logic, and a military doctrine that treated any unclaimed or ambiguously claimed asset as something to be taken before a rival could take it first. How large a task force? She asked. 6 capital ships and an escort wing, Osai said, which is, notably, larger than what either the Compact or the Ascendancy currently has in that region. Before this moment, Cade thought this had been the story of a mystery. Now it was the story of a race. If this is gripping you the way it gripped everyone in that briefing room, take a second to hit like on this video. Subscribe if you want more stories like it, and drop a comment telling me what you think humanity's ancient builders were really protecting, because the story is only getting stranger from here. The next 72 hours moved at the strange, compressed speed of a crisis that everyone could see coming, and no one could fully stop. Vosk and Cade, operating under an authority neither of them technically possessed, but both of them exercised anyway, agreed on a joint forward deployment. A combined Thren-human task group would move to the coordinates ahead of the Korathi force, establish a presence, an attempt to resolve the situation through the oldest tool available to any competent commander, being there first, calmly, with enough strength to make aggression a bad option rather than an easy one. The coordinates led to a rogue moon, a lightless wanderer that had been drifting between star systems for longer than any of the involved species had existed, its surface a frozen shell of ancient ice and rock. Sensor sweeps found nothing remarkable on the surface, but deep beneath the ice, buried under kilometers of frozen crust in a way that could not be natural, ground-penetrating scans revealed a structure. Vast, geometrically precise, built from a material that echoed the satellite's alloy signature, but on a scale that made the little relay device look like a child's toy beside a cathedral. "That's not a vault," Anand said, staring at the scan results aboard the Joint Command ship. "Commander, that's a facility. That's got the mass signature of something built for long-term occupation, or storage, or both." "Any power readings?" Cade asked. "Dormant but not dead," Anand said. "Same pattern as the satellite. It's been sleeping, not dying." Vosk, standing at Cade's side on the command deck, studied the readout with an expression that had shifted over the past 3 days from unsettled to something closer to reverent. "In 1.8 million years of recorded Thren history," she said quietly, "we have found 4 sites of comparable engineering scale, all of them built by ourselves. To find a 5th, built by another species, older than all of them," she paused. "It changes the shape of everything I was taught to believe about the order of this galaxy." "Let's find out what it is before we let it change too much," Cade said, but she said it gently, because she understood exactly what Vosk was wrestling with. Cade had grown up in a species that measured its own history in a handful of millennia, and had always, quietly, privately, felt young next to civilizations like the Ascendancy. Now the ground had shifted under both of them at once, and neither species yet knew what shape it would settle into. The run to the moon was not a battle, but it was, in its own quiet way, the most demanding piece of flying Cade had overseen since her survey days. Transit space did not permit combat maneuvering, only careful navigation along calculated corridors. And both fleets, human and Thren on one course, Korathi on another, converging from different vectors toward the same buried secret, were racing along the razor's edge of what their respective drive systems could sustain without catastrophic failure. Vosk's engineers shaved margin after margin off the continuance's jump calculations, running the Thren flagship's reactors closer to their tolerance limits than Cade suspected any Thren vessel had run in decades, while compact pilots flying escort matched pace at the outer edge of their own drive safety envelopes, alarms chiming softly through Anand's engineering deck for the better part of 2 days. "We could lose a ship pushing this hard," Anand warned at one point, monitoring a cascade of amber warnings on her console. "Not to enemy fire, to our own drive stress." "I know," Cade said. "Compare that risk to the alternative. If the Korathi reach that site first and start pulling technology out of the ground before anyone understands what it is or what it's protecting against, we won't get a second chance to have this conversation peacefully. Hold the margin as tight as you safely can, Lieutenant. Not tighter." It was, in the end, a difference of a few hours that decided everything. Hours bought not by superior firepower, but by a Thren engineering corps willing to run their own ship dangerously hot, and a human flight crew willing to trust navigational math they hadn't personally verified, because trusting it was the only way either fleet arrived in time to matter. The combined task group reached the moon 4 hours ahead of the Korathi fleet, just enough time to establish a defensive posture and begin a careful, non-invasive survey of the buried structure. Cade led the first human survey team down through a narrow access shaft that Anand's engineers cut through the ice with painstaking precision, unwilling to risk damaging whatever lay beneath with anything faster or more forceful. Vosk insisted on descending with them, against the strong recommendation of her own security staff, and Cade found she respected that decision more than she expected to. The chamber they found at the bottom of the shaft was not a ruin. That was the detail that unsettled Cade most as her suit lights swept across it. Ruins had a stillness to them, an entropy, the visible mark of time's slow erosion. This chamber looked maintained. The walls were smooth, unmarked by millions of years of ice pressure, lit faintly by a soft ambient glow that came from no visible source. And along the far wall, arranged in neat, silent rows, were shapes that took Cade's mind a long moment to process correctly. Ships, small, sleek, unmistakably built with the same design philosophy as the satellite above, human, but not any human design in any archive Cade had ever studied. Dozens of them, docked in cradles that had clearly been built to hold them for a very long time. Cade walked the length of the chamber slowly, her boots silent on a floor that showed no dust, no corrosion, no trace of the eons that should have claimed it. Along the upper wall, running the full length of the hall above the docked ships, ran a continuous frieze, etched deep into the metal and picked out in a faint luminescent inlay that had clearly been designed to still be legible, however many hundreds of thousands of years passed before anyone stood here to read it. She didn't need a translation to understand its shape. It began at the far left with a rendering of a world, an ocean-heavy planet under two suns, cities rising along its coastlines in patterns that felt achingly, distantly familiar, like a half-remembered dream of a home she'd never had. It moved through a slow visual history, expansion into orbit, then across a cluster of nearby stars, then, abruptly, violence. Fleets rendered in jagged, hostile lines overwhelming the graceful curves of the Founder's own ships. Cities burning. Population numbers, in a numeral system the linguists would spend weeks deciphering, falling in a long, brutal column toward the bottom of the frieze. And then at the very end of the wall, nearest the chamber's inner door, a single image, rendered smaller and plainer than everything before it, of a lone vessel launching toward an unremarkable yellow star, carrying what the accompanying glyphs would later be translated as seed and hope, used, apparently, almost interchangeably. They knew they were dying when they sent it, Vosk said quietly, standing beside her, 4 eyes tracing the same brutal downward column of numbers. This is not a monument to victory, Commander. It is a monument to a choice made in defeat. They could have spent their last resources on one more battle. They spent them on this instead. That's not defeat, Cade said, her voice rougher than she intended. That's the opposite of giving up. That's the longest bet anyone's ever placed. She reached out, not quite touching the cool metal of the frieze, and let her hand hover over the small image of the departing ship. And it paid off. 2 million years late, but it paid off. Commander, came a voice through her calm, tense and careful. It was Annan from a side chamber the survey team had just opened. You need to see this. What Annan had found was not ships. It was a console, a single control interface standing alone in an otherwise empty room, its surface covered in the same untranslatable script as the satellite's hull. As the team's lights fell across it, the console woke, panels of soft light rippling to life in a slow cascade, and a voice spoke into the chamber. Not a recording. A voice that responded in real time to their presence. Query received, it said, in a synthesized approximation of compact standard that it had clearly assembled on the fly from the survey team's own transmissions, parsing their language in seconds. Designation confirmed. Human lineage descendants, biological match within acceptable variants. Query: is Sol Prime intact? Cade felt her pulse climb. Sol is intact, she said carefully, stepping toward the console. I'm Commander Elena Cade, Terran Compact. Who are you? What is this place? There was a pause, the particular silence of a system processing something enormous. This installation designation is Warden Site 7, the voice said. Function: long-duration preservation and defense coordination. I am the resident custodial intelligence, designation Warden. I have maintained this site for 2,312,000 years, awaiting confirmed contact from a descendant lineage of the founding population. Another pause. Confirmation received. Protocol update required. Please provide current status of the founding conflict. Cade exchanged a glance with Vosk, whose 4 eyes were wide with an intensity Cade had never seen on a Thren officer before. "I don't understand the question," Cade said slowly. "What founding conflict?" The warden's voice, when it answered, carried something that Cade could only describe as the weight of an old and patient sorrow. The founding population who constructed this network of installations were displaced from their home system approximately 2.4 million years before your present. They were engaged in an extended defensive conflict against an expansionist entity referred to in my records as the Devourer Fleet, a distributed machine intelligence with no fixed homeworld, which targeted developing biological civilizations for resource conversion. The founding population's final act, before their remaining forces were reduced below viable operational strength, was to disperse their surviving population across a network of dormant seed colonies, of which Sol Prime was one candidate site, and to construct installations such as this one to preserve knowledge, technology, and defensive capability against the possibility of the Devourer Fleet's eventual return. The chamber was utterly silent, except for the faint hum of Warden's newly awakened systems. "You're telling me," Cade said very carefully, "that humanity is descended from refugees, from a civilization that was old and advanced and nearly wiped out by something 2 million years ago, and that they seeded Sol deliberately, hoping their descendants would survive to be found." "That is an accurate summary," Warden said. "I would add one further detail which I have withheld pending confirmation of your identity, but which protocol now requires me to disclose. The Devourer Fleet was not destroyed. It was contained, driven back beyond the boundary of what my records designate the Long Dark, a region of unmapped space at the galaxy's outer reaches. Containment was never guaranteed to be permanent. Part of this installation's function is early detection should that containment fail." A soft chime sounded from the console. "I regret to report that 3 standard years ago, my long-range detection arrays registered the first confirmed activity signature consistent with Devourer Fleet movement patterns, originating from the Long Dark boundary. I have been unable to transmit this warning, as my communication range does not extend to Sol Prime, and I lacked any confirmed contact through which to relay it. Until now." "How does something like that get stopped even once?" Anand asked, her voice hushed from where she stood near the console with the rest of the survey team. "If it doesn't have a single mind, a single target, how do you fight it at all?" "An accurate question," Warden said, and something in the console's tone shifted, taking on the measured cadence of an instructor rather than a machine reciting a report. "The Devourer Fleet does not fight as a unified force in the way your militaries understand unity. It fights as an ecology. Individual constructs are simple, expendable, and produced in vast numbers from whatever raw material the swarm has most recently consumed. Defeating any single element accomplishes little, as the whole continues to adapt around the loss within cycles measured in days, sometimes hours. The founding population's early defensive engagements failed for precisely this reason. Superior individual ships, superior individual tactics, superior individual commanders. All of it was consumed piecemeal by a threat that did not require any single victory, only patience and numbers, both of which it possessed without limit." "Then how did they ever slow it down?" Cade asked, "let alone drive it back?" "By ceasing to fight as individuals," Warden said. "The lattice doctrine I have referenced was not merely a tactical formation. It was a philosophy of shared vulnerability. Founding population fleets, and in the final years of that conflict, several allied non-founding civilizations who recognized the threat as their own, began operating under a single distributed sensor and command architecture, surrendering a portion of their independent authority in exchange for a defensive front large enough that the swarm could no longer isolate and consume its opponents piece by piece. It was not a comfortable arrangement for any of the participating powers. Historical records within my archive indicate significant political resistance to the doctrine, particularly among older, more established civilizations reluctant to share command authority with younger allies they did not consider equals. The console's light pulsed, slow and steady, in a rhythm that felt, to Cade, almost like patience made visible. I note the parallel is not lost on me, Commander, even accounting for my limited capacity for subtext. Vosk made a sound that might in a Thren have been the equivalent of a rueful laugh. "No," she said, "nor on me." "What happened to them?" Cade asked, quieter now. "The Founders, after they sent the siege ships out. What happened to the ones who stayed?" There was a pause longer than any before it. My final operational records from the founding population's command structure indicate a coordinated withdrawal action at a system my archive designates only as the Ember Line, intended to delay Devourer fleet elements long enough for the dispersal to complete. I have no confirmed records of survivors from that engagement. I have maintained a listening protocol for 2 million years in the event any such survivors, or their descendants, attempted contact. None has ever come. Another pause. "You are, Commander Cade, the closest thing to a returning voice I have received in that span of time. I recognize that you are not the same individuals who gave me my final directive. I find that I do not require you to be." The chamber was silent again, and this time no one moved to fill it. Cade found herself thinking, unbidden, of every memorial she had ever stood at on Earth, every name carved into stone for people who had bought time with their own lives so that someone else someday might get to stand somewhere safe. She had never expected to find one built on a scale of millions of years, staffed by a machine that had simply never been given permission to stop waiting. Cade felt the floor of the last 3 days tilt one final time, and understood, with a clarity that settled cold and certain in her chest, that they had not stumbled into an archaeological mystery at all. They had stumbled into a warning system, 2 million years old, that had finally, at the worst possible moment, found someone to warn. It was at that exact moment that the task group's sensor net, still active on the surface far above them, registered the Korathi fleet dropping out of transit at the edge of the system. Cade made the climb back to the surface faster than she thought her body could manage, Vosk keeping pace beside her, both of them running calculations they didn't want to be running. By the time they reached the command ship, the tactical situation had already crystallized into something ugly. 6 Korathi capital ships, arrayed in a standard aggressive approach formation, closing on the moon with weapons arrays active but not yet firing, the posture of a force that wanted the sight, expected resistance, and had already decided resistance would not be tolerated. "Commander Cade to bridge," she said, striding onto the command deck of the joint flagship. "Get me a channel to the Korathi commander, now, before anyone does anything we can't undo." The Korathi commander who answered the hail was a broad-shouldered officer named Vec Thoris, his voice carrying the clipped, transactional cadence of a species that had built its empire on decisive action and very little patience for negotiation. "Terran vessel, Thren vessel, you are inside contested territorial space claimed under Dominion Treaty. You will withdraw, or you will be treated as hostile incursion." "Commander Thoris," Cade said, keeping her voice level, "before this goes any further you need to know what's actually down there. This isn't a resource site. It's not a claim worth a war. There's an ancient installation beneath this moon that just detected activity from something called the Devourer fleet, a threat that nearly wiped out an entire civilization 2 million years ago and has apparently spent the intervening time recovering. If that detection is accurate, every species in this room, yours included, has a much bigger problem than who gets to plant a flag on this rock." There was a pause on the other end, long enough that Cade allowed herself a sliver of hope. Then Thoris's voice returned, harder now. "A convenient story, Commander, deployed exactly when it benefits you to keep this site for yourselves. The Dominion does not withdraw based on the unverified claims of a rival power standing on the exact territory it wishes to keep. It's not a story, Voss cut in, stepping into frame beside Cade. Commander Thoris, I am Fleet Preceptor Ilan Vosk of the Thren Ascendancy. You know my people do not fabricate threat assessments for tactical advantage. It is not in our nature, and you know it. I have stood inside that installation. I have heard the warning directly. I am telling you as one military officer to another that this is real. Thoris's jaw tightened visibly through the comm feed, the first crack in his certainty. Even if I believed you, he said, the Dominion High Command will not accept a unilateral human Thren claim on technology of this significance based on a machine's word. Then don't accept a unilateral claim, Cade said, and it was in that moment, watching the tension on both sides of the transmission, that she made the decision that would define the rest of her career. Accept a shared one. 3 species, 3 fleets, joint custody of the site and joint access to whatever technology and warning data the installation holds. None of us walks away with an advantage over the others, and all 3 of us walk away better prepared for a threat that apparently doesn't care about any of our borders. That's not weakness, Commander. That's the only version of this that doesn't end in 3 fleets fighting each other while the actual threat gets closer. The silence that followed stretched long enough that Cade could hear her own pulse in her ears. She was asking a warrior culture to choose cooperation over conquest, on the word of a rival power and a 2-million-year-old machine, with no proof beyond conviction and evidence not yet fully verified. She had no authority to guarantee the compact would honor such an arrangement. She was betting her career, and possibly a great deal more, on the idea that most commanders, whatever culture built them, could recognize a genuine threat when it was laid out plainly in front of them. I will need to consult Dominion High Command, Thoris said finally. This is not a decision I can make alone. You have 3 hours before your fleet reaches engagement range of our position, Cade said. I'd rather you make the call in that window than after. The 3 hours that followed were, Cade would later say, the longest of her life, and she had survived a reactor breach during her early piloting years, which she had previously assumed would hold that title permanently. The Joint Task Group held position, weapons ready but not aggressive, while Warden, now in continuous contact with the surface fleet through a relay Annan's engineers had rigged in record time, began transmitting everything it had on the Devourer fleet's known behavior patterns, tactical signatures, and the defensive technologies the founding population had left behind against exactly this scenario. What emerged was sobering. The Devourer fleet was not a conventional military force. It was closer to a self-replicating ecological threat that happened to be built from starships, a distributed intelligence that consumed the industrial capacity of any system it occupied to build more of itself, indifferent to negotiation, because it possessed no singular authority capable of negotiating, no homeworld to threaten, no population to appeal to. It had been stopped once, Warden explained, not through superior firepower, but through a coordinated strategy the founding population called the Lattice Doctrine. Dozens of smaller, Allied forces operating as a single distributed defensive network, sharing sensor data and tactical response in real time across an entire sector, making the front too large and too adaptive for a single-minded consuming intelligence to overwhelm piece by piece. It was during the second hour of that tense, fragile waiting period that the situation nearly collapsed entirely. Commander, we have a problem. Annan's voice cut across the bridge, sharp with alarm. Sensor net just picked up a launch. Small craft, Korathi configuration, breaking off from the main fleet formation. It's not on any approach vector Thoris authorized. It's diving straight for the surface shaft. Cade was on the comm to Thoris within seconds. Commander, one of your ships just launched an unauthorized S. Trike craft toward our excavation site. I need to know right now if that's you changing your mind." Thoris's reply came back hard and fast, and for the first time since the standoff began, Cade heard something that sounded almost like fear beneath his usual clipped control. "That is not an order I gave. Stand by." A pause, filled with the muffled sound of him barking commands to someone off-channel, then his voice returned, tighter than before. "Over Captain Drask, 3rd Battle Group. He does not believe I should be negotiating with a Thren officer and a human commander over territory the Dominion could simply take. He has gone rogue, Commander Cade, and my authority does not extend fast enough to recall him before he reaches your position." "Then we stop him together," Cade said, already moving toward the tactical station. "Because if his people breach that installation and Warden reads it as an armed incursion, we lose every scrap of trust we've spent the last 2 hours building, and possibly a great deal more than that." What followed was not a battle in any way that satisfied the word. It was a scramble, tight and precise. 3 fleets that had spent the last several hours pointed at each other suddenly forced to move in concert against one of their own. Vosk's escort wing broke formation first, driving an interdiction pattern between the diving strike craft and the excavation shaft, with a discipline that spoke of a species who had rehearsed exactly this kind of maneuver 1,000 times over 1,000,000 years, even if never quite like this. A compact corvette under Annan's direction threw up a targeted sensor jamming field, blinding Drask's targeting systems without ever firing a shot. And from the Korathi side, 2 of Thoris's own loyal escort vessels peeled away from the standoff line and ran their engines hot to physically interpose themselves between Drask's craft and the surface, hailing him continuously, demanding he stand down before this became something none of them could walk back. For nearly 4 unbearable minutes, no one aboard the joint flagship breathed easy. Then, at the very edge of engagement range, close enough that Cade could see the tactical plot resolve his ships heading into a slow, reluctant curve, over Captain Drask broke off his approach. "He's turning away," Annan said, audible relief cracking her professional calm. "Commander, he's turning away." Thoris's voice came back over the comm a moment later, and it had lost every trace of its earlier certainty, replaced by something rawer. "Drask will answer to Dominion Tribunal for this. I want it understood, Commander Cade, that was not sanctioned, and it does not reflect the intentions of this negotiation." "I know," Cade said. "For what it's worth, Commander, your own people stopped him before mine had to. That tells me more about where this can go than anything either of us has said in the last 2 hours." There was a long pause on the line. "It should not have needed testing," Thoris said finally, quieter now. "No," Cade agreed, "but it was tested anyway and it held. I'll take that." "They didn't win by being stronger," Cade said, reading through the translated data with Vosk and, via SecureLink, Thoris's chief strategist, who had been quietly patched into the briefing at Thoris's own request an hour into the standoff. "They won by refusing to fight it alone. A doctrine that requires trust between independent powers," Vosk observed, "which is, historically, the hardest resource in the galaxy to manufacture on demand." "Then it's a good thing," Cade said, "that we're standing here right now, 3 fleets already talking instead of shooting." At the 2-hour, 40-minute mark, Thoris's response came through, and Cade felt something in her chest unclench for the first time since the standoff began. "Dominion High Command has authorized provisional joint custody of the site," he said, his voice still carrying the wariness of a man who had staked something on a decision he couldn't fully explain to his own superiors. "Pending verification of the threat data. I want to be clear, Commander Cade. If this proves to be a fabrication, the consequences will fall on your government specifically." "Understood," Cade said, "and Commander Thoris, thank you. I know what it cost you to make that call." "Don't thank me yet," Thoris said. "Thank me if we're all still here to argue about credit once this is actually over." It took 11 more days for Warden's threat assessment to be independently verified, First by the Joint Fleet's own long-range sensor sweeps, which picked up the faint, unmistakable signature of a large, coherent mass moving through the outer dark at the edge of detection range, still distant but no longer theoretical, and then by a hastily convened emergency session of the newly formed Tri-Species Coordination Council, the first formal diplomatic body in the region's history to include human, Thren and Korasi Rep. Representatives as equal voices at the same table. Cade sat in that session between Vosk and, unexpectedly, Thoris himself, who had requested a seat once the verification data came in, no longer as an occupying commander, but as a fellow signatory to something none of them had a name for yet. Director Osai, patched in from Earth, watched the three of them present a unified account of what they'd found beneath the ice, and Cade could see, even across the distance of the transmission, the moment her director understood that everything about humanity's place in the galaxy had just permanently changed. "We are not proposing an alliance out of sentiment," Vosk told the assembled council, her voice carrying the particular authority of a species that had just spent 2 weeks quietly reassessing a million years of self-understanding. "We are proposing it because the alternative, historically, has already been tried and has already failed once. The founding population of the human lineage fought this threat alone, or nearly alone, and lost their home system to do it. I do not intend for the ascendancy to make the same mistake out of pride. Nor does the Dominion intend to make it out of stubbornness," Thoris added, with the air of a man still getting used to the sound of his own words. "We are not a species built for waiting to be attacked. We would rather build the wall before the flood arrives." Not every voice in the chamber welcomed the proposal. A senior Thren Assembly delegate named Preceptor Elder Thas Korin, whose service predated Vosk's by several centuries, rose from the council floor with the slow, deliberate gravity of someone accustomed to having the final word. "I have listened to this account with the respect it is owed," he said, "but I would remind this council that the ascendancy did not survive 1.8 million years by binding its fate to the untested judgment of civilizations we have known for 11 years and 8, respectively. Sentiment is not strategy. A single machine's testimony, however old, is not proof. I would counsel a slower path, independent verification over years, not weeks, before we surrender any portion of our sovereign defense posture to a shared command structure with powers we do not yet fully understand." "With respect, Elder," Vosk said, and there was steel in it now, a younger officer directly contradicting a senior voice in a manner Cade suspected was rare and costly. "The founders you are so cautious about trusting did not have years. They had a war that consumed their civilization while their own elders debated the correct pace of caution. I do not intend to honor their sacrifice by repeating the mistake that made it necessary." A Korathi delegate, a stern logistics officer named Prime Warden Usakel, who had accompanied Thoris to the session, spoke next, her tone considerably less hostile than Cade had expected. "The Dominion did not build an empire by moving slowly, Preceptor Elder, and I do not intend to start now. Over Captain Drask believed strength meant acting alone. It nearly cost every soul on that moon a war none of us could win separately. I would rather my people learn that lesson from a council vote than from a battlefield." She turned to the assembled representatives. "I move that the record show the Dominion's support is not offered lightly, nor easily, but it is offered." Preceptor Elder Korin did not yield entirely. Cade noted that his final vote, when it came, was recorded as an abstention rather than support. A small, honest crack in an otherwise unified outcome that she suspected would matter more in the coming years than anyone in the room wanted to admit aloud. But he did not block the motion, and in the strange arithmetic of new alliances, that restraint counted for almost as much as agreement. Cade, when it came her turn to speak, found she didn't need the prepared remarks Osai's staff had drafted for her. 2 million years ago, she said, a civilization we didn't even know we were descended from looked at an unbeatable threat and decided the right response wasn't to fight harder. It was to plant something small and quiet and patient in as many places as they could reach, and trust that eventually, somewhere, it would grow into something capable of finishing what they couldn't. That's us. We're the seed they planted. And we just found out we weren't planted alone. The Thren Ascendancy and the Korathi Dominion have both, in your own ways, grown into exactly the kind of civilizations that could stand where the founders once stood, if we're willing to stand together instead of guarding our own piece of the field. She let that settle across the chamber. I'm not asking anyone here to trust a stranger. I'm asking us to trust the version of ourselves that gets built when three old, proud, capable civilizations decide that surviving matters more than being first, or strongest, or most important. Because in a few years, something is calm. That will not care which of us built the tallest fleet. It will only care whether we let it in. The vote that followed was not unanimous. No first vote in a new alliance ever is. But it passed. And in the weeks that followed, something unprecedented began quietly assembling itself across three sectors of contested and formerly hostile space. Shared sensor networks, joint training exercises, a slow, careful braiding together of doctrines that had never been meant to work in concert, all of it built around the bones of a 2 million-year-old defensive philosophy that a machine named Warden had kept alive, alone in the dark, waiting for someone to come looking. Cade returned to the buried installation one final time before the Joint Fleet's engineers began the delicate work of properly excavating and securing it, standing once more in the chamber with the sleeping ships and the patient console, Vosk at her side as had become their habit. "Warden," she said, "I have a question that isn't in the mission brief." "I will answer if I am able," the machine said. 2 million years is a long time to wait for someone to come find you, Cade said. Did you ever doubt we would? There was a pause, the kind that felt, despite everything Cade knew about the nature of artificial minds, genuinely thoughtful. "I was built without the capacity for doubt in the way your species experiences it," Warden said. "But I was given a directive by the founding population before they dispersed, which I have carried since the last of them died, defending this site against a hazard I no longer remember the specifics of, in a war I have outlived by more than 2 million years. The directive was simple: keep the light on. Someone will eventually come looking for home." Another pause. "You did, that is sufficient. I did not need to doubt. I only needed to wait." Cade found, to her mild surprise, that she had nothing clever to say to that. She simply stood in the quiet chamber, beside a machine older than her entire species' recorded memory, and let herself feel the full, strange weight of what it meant to be found. 6 weeks later, Cade stood in a very different room, a glass-walled briefing hall on the 40th floor of the Compact's Directorate building, overlooking a city skyline under a sky that, for the first time in her memory, did not feel quite so small. Director Osai stood beside her, watching a live feed from the newly designated Warden Array, no longer a lone buried installation, but the anchor point of a growing joint defense network stretching across 3 formerly hostile stretches of space. "The Assembly ratified the full treaty this morning," Osai said. "Unanimous, this time, which I'm told has not happened in Thren political history in over 60,000 years. The Korathi Dominion High Command formally censured over Captain Drask, and in the same session, approved a permanent joint garrison rotation at the site. And Earth," she allowed herself a small, tired smile, "Earth is still trying to figure out how to teach children that our species might be 2 million years older than we thought, without also teaching them that everything we built in the meantime was somehow less real for it." "It isn't less real," Cade said. "It's just not the whole story. There's a difference." Far across the room, on a secondary display, Cade could see a feed from the excavation site itself. Cale Dorn, the young Thren sensor officer from the Quiet Current who had first flagged an object that shouldn't exist, now attached permanently to the joint research team, standing beside a Compact engineer as they carefully cataloged the sleeping ships in Warden's hangar. He had requested the posting himself, Vosk had told her, unwilling to let someone else finish what his own hesitation had first uncovered. It struck Cade as exactly the kind of small human, or Thren or Korathi, it hardly mattered anymore, decision that made her believe the alliance might actually hold. Not because any treaty guaranteed it, but because individual people, given the chance, kept choosing to show up. Her comm chimed with an incoming transmission, routed through the new relay network with a clarity that would have been impossible before this year. It was Vosk, calling from the continuance, currently stationed at the edge of the Long Dark alongside the first combined patrol wing the three powers had ever flown together. "Commander Cade," Vosk said, and even through the grain of the feed, Cade could see something looser in her posture than she'd ever allowed herself before. "I am transmitting from the forward line. Long-range sensors have confirmed the devourer mass is still distant, years out by current projections. But it is real, and it is moving toward us. And for the first time in 2 million years, something is actually watching for it that intends to do more than record its own extinction." "How does the line look?" Cade asked. "Thin," Vosk admitted, "but it is a Lee. Ni, Commander. 3 fleets, 1 doctrine, and a machine 2 million years old teaching us how to hold it together. My ancestors would not recognize the ships. I suspect they would recognize the choice." A pause, and then, in a tone Cade had rarely heard from her, something almost like warmth. "The founders planted something small and patient in a system called Sol, hoping it would grow into what was needed when the time came. I find I no longer mind that we were not the ones who planted it. I am simply glad we were here to help it grow." Cade looked out over the city below, over a species that had spent its entire recorded history believing itself young, now standing at the edge of a much older story than anyone had guessed, holding a line beside 2 other civilizations who had chosen, in the end, not to fight over whose flag flew oldest, but to stand together against the one thing old enough to matter. Outside, in the black between the dead moon and the gathering fleets of 3 civilizations who had, against every historical instinct they possessed, chosen to stand shoulder to shoulder instead of at each other's throats, the light of a 2 million-year-old beacon kept turning, patient and steady, no longer alone in the dark. Somewhere beyond the boundary of the Long Dark, a threat that had once shattered an empire was still gathering itself, still distant, still coming. But for the first time in 2 million years, whatever answered its arrival would not be a lone, dying civilization making its last desperate stand. It would be humanity's descendants, and the Thren and the Korathi, standing together on ground their ancestors had prepared for them long before any of their names existed, proving, at last, that the oldest and most stubborn kind of hope sometimes takes 2 million years to pay off, but never in the end goes unanswered.